This podcast is brought to you by Liminal Martech. Liminal is the first Portuguese company specialized in strategic consulting and marketing operations. If you want to grow your business and deliver better customer experiences with marketing technologies such as CRM, automation, and BI, go to www.liminal.pt and find out how. Go to www.liminal.pt to know Salesforce, HubSpot, Zoho, or Ample Market Solutions. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that, well, kind of keeps marketers up at night.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling.
How do we use data the right way, get results, but not trip over all those GDPR wires?
It is a tightrope walk, that's for sure.
And that's where Sachiko Scheuing's book, How to Use Customer Data, comes in.
A great read, by the way. Really gets into the nuts and bolts. And people are noticing, too, both in marketing and data privacy. Folks are praising it.
Yeah, it's not just like theoretical stuff,
Yeah.
It gets into the actual risks we face as marketers when we're dealing with data.
Right, like it doesn't just rehash those abstract data protection principles.
Right.
It goes deeper, focusing on the specific risks linked to marketing data.
We're talking real-world stuff here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of those big, scary risks we need to have on our radar?
Well, the book highlights four main areas. First off, the increased vulnerability to crime.
Yeah, data breaches, every marketer's nightmare.
Exactly. And with marketers sharing data so often with partners, agencies, that security is just paramount.
Makes sense. So keeping the bad guys out.
But it's not just about hackers.
Oh, right.
It's also about how that information gets used, making sure it doesn't actually harm someone. That's what the book calls decontextualization.
Okay, decontextualization. So, what does that look like in practice?
Think about your online purchases,
Yeah.
right? Imagine that data gets used to make assumptions about you, like, oh, your financial stability or even your health. Information taken out of context and potentially used against you.
Not exactly the ideal customer experience.
Definitely not.
So we've got data breaches and decontextualization. What's next on this list of data dangers?
The emergence of information, it's kind of about how seemingly harmless data points, when you combine them, they can create, well, unexpected new knowledge.
Oh, that's interesting. Give me an example so I can wrap my head around that.
Like building super detailed profiles based on, say, website clicks, or even using AI to, predict what a consumer might do next.
So it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about those unintended consequences. And speaking of AI, that's a whole other area where data protection gets really interesting.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to circle back to AI. It feels like a whole other tightrope walk.
It is.
But, okay, back to those risks. We've got 3 so far. What's the 4th one?
The 4th one might seem a bit obvious, but it's crucial. Information inaccuracy. Bad data, well, that just leads to bad decisions.
Right. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Exactly. And it's not just bad for business, it's an ethical issue, too.
So it's not about saying no to data altogether.
No, not at all.
It's about being smart, using it responsibly, and, of course, making sure it's accurate. But where did all this data protection stuff even begin? Where did these rules come from?
Well, the history of data protection is actually pretty fascinating. Back in the 80s, you had organizations like the OECD and the Council of Europe.
Okay.
And they were really starting to raise the flag about data privacy.
So this was even before the internet as we know it today.
Oh, yeah. This was like the early days of computers and large-scale data processing. They were the trailblazers, in a way.
Ahead of their time.
Totally. They saw the potential for harm, for misuse, so they started pushing for a framework, something to protect individuals.
And I imagine things really shifted when the internet exploded and online marketing took off.
Oh, absolutely. A huge turning point was, well, everybody knows it, the cookie law.
Ah, yes, the cookies.
Yeah.
Those little digital crumbs we leave everywhere we go online.
Right. The e-privacy directive back in the early 2000s, suddenly marketers had to get explicit consent before setting those cookies.
Especially for all that targeted advertising, right?
That's right. It was a big change.
It was. But it's not just the rules that have changed, right? Marketing itself has gone through a complete transformation.
Oh, yeah.
We're not in the, Mad Men era anymore, are we?
Not even close.
It's all about the customer now.
Exactly. Customer-centric, that's the name of the game. Understanding their journey, all those touch points.
Building those relationships.
It's about trust, showing them we respect their data, their privacy.
Okay, but real talk, do consumers actually care about this stuff? Or is it more of a box we need to tick?
They care. There's research from the Global Data and Marketing Alliance, the GDMA, showing that, while people like personalized stuff, they also get, well, a bit wary of all that data collection going on.
Yeah, it can feel a bit creepy sometimes.
Definitely. For consumers, trust and transparency are more valuable than, say, getting a discount.
Makes sense. They want to feel in control, not like they're being, constantly mined for data.
Absolutely.
So where does GDPR fit into all of this? It feels like the elephant in the room, right?
It is. It's about setting clear guidelines, for how we collect, use, process all that personal data.
Okay, so GDPR is about being responsible, not about just shutting down all our marketing efforts.
Right. It's about doing it the right way. And to do that, marketers need to understand the basics, starting with, like, what even is personal data?
Good point. Because it's more than just names and addresses, right?
Oh, way more. GDPR casts a wide net. Any information that relates to, let's say, an identifiable person, that's personal data.
So like an IP address, a cookie, even a customer segment.
Yep, all of that can be personal data.
Wait, customer segments too. So if I say, like, Sarah is a fashion enthusiast, that falls under GDPR.
It could, yeah, especially if that segment is, used to make choices about what Sarah sees, what information she gets. The book actually is a great example with a car dealership and a survey.
Okay, tell me about this car dealership survey.
They ask about things like, car models, family size, even addresses.
Sounds pretty standard for market research, right?
Exactly. But what the book highlights is that even seemingly harmless things, when you combine them, you can identify someone.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this gets tricky. So how do we, as marketers, make sure we're doing this right? Using data responsibly, respecting those GDPR rules.
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's exactly what we're going to explore after the break.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were getting into the nitty-gritty of personal data, how even seemingly harmless bits of info, you combine them, and suddenly you've got enough to pinpoint an individual.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you think about it. It really underscores how careful we need to be.
Absolutely. And that leads us to, well, kind of the heart of GDPR for marketers, lawful grounds for processing.
The foundation of responsible data use, really.
Okay, so let's demystify this a bit. What exactly are these lawful grounds, and how do they, play out in the real world of marketing?
Essentially, GDPR gives you 6 reasons why you're allowed to process personal data.
6 reasons. All right.
But for us, in marketing, 2 really matter: contract and legitimate interest.
Okay, contract and legitimate interest. Contract seems straightforward enough. Someone buys something from my shop online, I need their address to, well, ship it to them. That's a contract.
Exactly. You've got a contractual obligation there.
Uh-huh.
But contract as a basis for most marketing activities, well, it's pretty limited.
Right, because people aren't signing a contract just to get, like, promo emails or see targeted ads.
Precisely. That's where legitimate interest comes in.
All right. Legitimate interest, that's the one everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
But is it really a free pass? Can we just say, hey, we want to sell you stuff, so we're using your data, and that's it?
Not quite. There's more to it than that. You need a genuine reason, and it can't clash with the individual's rights and freedoms.
So there's, like, a balancing act.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance. And GDPR makes it clear the individual's rights usually win out. Think of it as a 3-part test. First, you need a clear purpose. Can't be vague, like, we want to increase sales.
Got it. So more specific, like, we're using browsing history to suggest products that, actually match your interests.
Perfect. That's a clear purpose. Second, you got to prove it's necessary. Like, is there another way to do it without using personal data? If there is, well, legitimate interest might not fly.
Makes sense. So clear purpose, necessity. What's the third part of this test?
The balancing test. Weighing your interest against, the person's rights and freedoms. Could using the data this way potentially infringe on their privacy? If the answer is yes, then legitimate interest probably isn't going to cut it.
So it's not just about having a reason. It's got to be a good one.
Yeah.
And we need to prove we've thought it through, right?
Documentation is key here. Showing that you've considered these factors, that's really important, and that ties into transparency.
Right, transparency. Okay, so how do we actually communicate all this to our customers? It's one thing for us to understand GDPR, but how do we explain it in a way that, makes sense, builds trust?
That's where privacy statements come in.
Oh, yeah, those things. Not exactly known for being, like, page turners, are they?
No, they can be a bit dry, but instead of seeing them as a chore, think of it as an open conversation.
Okay, I like that. But how do we make them, actually readable, engaging? Most privacy statements are about as exciting as watching paint dry.
Well, luckily, GDPR actually requires them to be clear, concise, plain language.
So ditch the legal jargon.
Exactly. Write it so your grandma could understand it.
Grandma-friendly privacy statements. I love it. What else can we do to make them easier to digest?
Think visually. Clear headings, bullet points, maybe even some visuals to break things up. And answer those key questions. What data are we collecting? Why? How are we using it? And what are their rights?
So it's like anticipating their concerns, being upfront.
Right. And GDPR has specifics on what needs to be in there. Contact info for your data protection officer, a clear explanation of why you're processing the data, the legal basis for each purpose.
So instead of just saying, like, we use your data for marketing, we need to be specific. Like, we're using your email for personalized recommendations, and our legal basis is legitimate interest.
Exactly. You also got to say what data you're collecting, how long you'll keep it, all those rights individuals have under GDPR. And don't forget, international data transfers. If that data is going outside the EU, well, you need to say where it's going and what safeguards are in place.
So if we're using, like, a US-based cloud provider, that needs to be in there, right?
Absolutely. And the legal mechanism, too. Are you using standard contractual clauses, SCCs, binding corporate rules, BCRs? Transparency is key.
Okay, so privacy statements, they're more than just a legal box to tick. They're about communication, building trust, showing accountability.
Exactly. And speaking of accountability, let's move on to data subject rights. This is where things can get a bit, well, tricky.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like opening Pandora's box, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All those rights consumers have under GDPR. How do we actually manage all those requests? Feels like a logistical nightmare.
It can be, yeah. But GDPR gives us a framework, and some rights are more relevant to marketers than others.
All right, give me the need-to-know rundown. Which ones should we be focusing on?
One of the most common is the right to rectification. Someone asks you to fix something that's wrong, like about their information.
So a typo in their address, they want to update their email preferences, that kind of thing.
Right. Or maybe they think you have their purchase history wrong, but things get more interesting when it's subjective, like those segment assignments.
Ah, yeah, because those segments are based on, well, our interpretation of their behavior, right?
Exactly. The book has this example, a cashmere company, they segment customers by, purchase history. And one customer, they objected to being labeled a winter sports enthusiast. They saw themselves as more fashion conscious.
So does the company have to change the segment?
Not necessarily. Segments are opinions, and opinions can't really be wrong.
That's an interesting point.
But the company might choose to change it anyway, just to, keep the customer happy and align with how they see themselves.
Finding that balance again.
Exactly. Another one is the right to erasure, that right to be forgotten.
Okay, that one seems pretty simple. Someone says, delete me, we delete them.
In theory,
Yeah.
yeah. But in practice, it gets messy with backups.
Backups. Always a data protection headache.
Definitely. GDPR says delete everything, backups included. But the UK's ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, they have a more flexible take on this.
Okay, tell me more about the ICO's view. This sounds important.
They get that purging backups can be, well, really tough, even risky. Imagine trying to delete just one person's data from a huge backup file. You can mess up the whole thing.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So what's the ICO's recommendation?
Focus on making the data unusable. If your backup cycle is, say, 28 days, well, those backups will get overwritten anyway, naturally, within that 1-month time frame GDPR gives you.
Oh, so we don't need to go in and manually delete everything as long as it'll be overwritten within that month.
Right. Saves a lot of time and potential headaches.
I can imagine. What other rights do we need to be aware of?
The right to restrict processing. It's about, someone saying, hey, I don't want you to use my data for this specific thing, like profiling or targeted ads.
So they can choose how their data gets used, even for specific purposes.
Exactly. And then there's the right to object, really important for direct marketing.
Okay, that one's a biggie. Someone says, stop sending me marketing emails. We got to stop. No questions asked, right?
That's the gist of it. They can opt out anytime.
Control over their data. That's a running theme here. Okay, what about the right to access? The one everyone knows, right?
Yeah, that's the one. This one wants to see all the data you have on them. It's called a subject access request, a SAR.
Ah, yes. The SARs. Heard some scary stories about those, especially for companies with, data all over the place.
Yeah, it takes coordination, and you got to respond quickly, usually within a month.
So clear procedures are a must. But do we always have to comply? Are there, any exceptions?
The right to access isn't absolute. There are some exemptions, like if complying would harm someone else's rights.
Okay, so there are nuances. Good to know.
Mm.
We've talked about a lot here, lawful grounds, those data subject rights. GDPR's impact on marketing is pretty clear. But marketing, it's rarely a solo act, right? We work with agencies, partners, all sorts of folks. How do we navigate data protection when other companies are involved?
You're absolutely right. Bringing in third parties definitely adds another layer of complexity. But don't worry, GDPR provides a framework for managing those relationships, making sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to protecting data.
Okay, good to know. So, what's the key thing to keep in mind when we're collaborating with others?
First, you need to understand the different kinds of relationships. You've got controller to controller, where each organization is acting as a controller, but for different purposes.
So, like if I'm working with an agency to run a campaign, we're both controllers, but we have different responsibilities.
Precisely. You're the controller for the customer data you collected. The agency's the controller for the data they use to, manage the campaign itself.
Shared responsibility. Got it.
Exactly. And GDPR requires controllers to clearly define those roles, usually through a contract. It's about avoiding any confusion, making it clear who's accountable for what.
Makes sense. But what about those times when one organization is like calling the shots and the other one's just, handling the data on their behalf?
That's a controller to processor setup. You're the controller, they're the processor, and GDPR has specific rules for that.
All right, so let's say we're hiring an agency to run our email marketing. They're the processor, we're the controller. What are the rules of the road here?
First, you got to make sure that any processor you work with can actually handle the data in a GDPR compliant way.
So we can't just go with the cheapest option. We need to do our homework. Make sure they've got their Data Protection Act together.
Exactly. Check their policies, security, how they handle data subject requests. You want proof, not just promises.
Right. Walk the walk, not just talk the talk. What else is important here?
A solid data processing agreement, or DPA, is absolutely crucial.
Okay, DPA time. What exactly is a DPA and why is it so important?
Think of it as the rule book for how the processor can handle your data. It's a legally binding contract,
Oh,
outlines all the details, what they're doing with the data, why, what kind of data, security measures, even their obligations for those data subject rights we talked about.
so it's setting clear boundaries from the get-go.
Exactly. And while we're on the subject of working with partners, let's touch on international data transfers.
Yes, because GDPR has all those rules about sending data outside the EU, right? What are the must-knows when we're working with partners in other countries or using cloud services that, aren't based in the EU?
You're right, that's a critical point. GDPR wants to make sure data stays protected no matter where it goes. So if you're sending it outside the EU, you need a valid legal reason.
Okay, a valid reason. What are our options here?
Standard contractual clauses, or SCCs, are pretty common. These are pre-approved clauses that, provide a framework for data protection when you're sending data to countries that the European Commission hasn't deemed adequate.
Adequate. What makes a country adequate in GDPR terms?
The Commission looks at their data protection laws,
Hmm.
decides if they're basically as strong as GDPR. If they are, data transfers are generally considered safe.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So partner in an adequate country, no extra hoops to jump through.
Generally, yes. But that list of adequate countries can change, so gotta stay updated.
Good point. So for those countries that aren't adequate, that's where the SECs come in.
Exactly. They provide that extra layer of protection, making sure the data is handled right, even if the country's laws aren't as strong.
Safety net for our data when it's traveling abroad. Are there other options besides SECs?
Yeah, there are binding corporate rules, or BCRs. These are like internal rules that multinational companies can use for data transfers within their own group.
So if our company has offices in the EU and the US, we can use BCRs to govern those data transfers between offices.
Right, but BCRs, they're more complex, more resource intensive. They need approval from European data protection authorities.
Probably not the best choice for smaller companies just starting out with international data transfers.
Probably not. It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
This is a lot to take in. We've covered lawful grounds, those data subject rights, working with partners. But there's one more big thing, and I think we all dread it. Data breaches. Feels like they're happening more and more. How can we make sure we're not the next headline?
Data breaches, yeah, they're a real concern for everyone, especially when you're dealing with personal data. But there are things we can do to protect ourselves, minimize the risk.
Okay, so let's talk data security. What are the essentials we need to know to protect our data, our reputation?
The foundation is understanding information security. It's about protecting both the information itself and the systems that hold it. Unauthorized access, disruption, modification, destruction, we want to prevent all of that.
So not just about hackers. It's about keeping data safe from anything, accidental or malicious.
That's right. And there are different ways to approach this. One popular one is the CIA triad.
CIA, like the spy agency.
Not exactly, but there are some similarities. Confidentiality, keeping data secret, only authorized people can access it. Integrity, making sure data is accurate and hasn't been tampered with. And availability, making sure authorized people can actually access it when they need to.
Secret, accurate, accessible. Got it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's another framework that builds on that, the Parkerian hexad.
Arcarian hexad. Okay, that's a new one.
It adds 3 more elements: possession or control, authenticity, and utility.
So we're expanding on those core principles. What do these new ones mean for data security?
Possession or control means knowing who has the data, who's in control. Authenticity is about making sure it's real, hasn't been messed with. And utility is about ensuring it's actually usable, not corrupted or inaccessible.
So who has it? Is it real? And can we use it? Got it.
Yep. And GDPR really emphasizes those technical and organizational measures, or TOMs, to protect the data.
Comms. Okay. What are some examples of these measures, and how do we actually put them into practice?
TOMs can be anything you do to safeguard the data. On the technical side, strong passwords, two-factor authentication, encrypting sensitive data, and keeping your software up to date, patching vulnerabilities.
So building those digital walls, making sure our systems are locked down tight.
Exactly. But TOMs also cover organizational stuff, like clear policies for handling data, access controls, and really importantly, training for employees on data protection best practices.
Right, because the best security in the world won't help if someone writes their password on a sticky note.
Exactly. It's about making data protection part of your company culture.
A holistic approach, tech and people working together.
Okay, what about pseudonymization and encryption? I hear those words a lot these days. How do they fit into all of this?
GDPR highlights them as great tools. Pseudonymization is about, replacing identifying info with something else, like an ID number, makes it harder to link the data back to a specific person.
So, like giving everyone a code name to protect their identity.
That's a great way to think about it. Encryption is scrambling the data so it's unreadable without the key, like locking it in a safe.
Okay, so pseudonymization masks identities, and encryption adds another layer of security, making the data itself unreadable. Got it. What about, the human side of security? How do we make sure everyone in the company takes data protection seriously? Awareness training is essential. GDPR really pushes for training employees on data protection, the principles, the best practices. And this shouldn't be a one-time thing. It needs to be ongoing.
Right, because data protection is constantly evolving. We need to keep up. Okay, but let's be real. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, breaches happen. What happens then?
That's when those data breach notification procedures come in. GDPR has rules for notifying authorities and sometimes individuals when a breach occurs.
Okay, this is where things get serious. What are those rules? How fast do we have to act?
First, assess how bad the breach is. GDPR says you need to report it to your supervisory authority without undue delay, and if you can, within 72 hours of finding out about it.
72 hours. That's not a lot of time.
It's a tight window, definitely. But the idea is to loop in the authorities quickly so they can investigate and do what they need to do to limit the damage.
Okay, that makes sense. Do we always have to tell the individuals whose data was affected? Or are there times when we can, keep it quiet?
You don't always have to notify individuals. GDPR only requires it if the breach is likely to put their rights and freedoms at risk.
So like if someone hacks in and gets a bunch of email addresses, but nothing more sensitive, we might not have to notify everyone.
That's possible, but you need a proper risk assessment to be sure.
Right, because the last thing we want is to underestimate the problem and have it blow up later.
Exactly. And even if you're not legally required to tell individuals, sometimes it's the right thing to do for PR reasons, for transparency.
Absolutely. Being upfront and honest goes a long way. So it sounds like good security, it pays off. Preventing breaches and mitigating the damage when they happen.
No question about it. Strong security is your best friend.
This deep dive into data protection has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much. GDPR is more than just checking boxes. It's about building a whole culture of data responsibility.
It's about seeing it as part of building trust with customers, creating those long-term relationships.
Absolutely. But the landscape is changing, right? AI is coming in, shaking things up. How does that impact our approach to data privacy?
AI is a game changer, for sure. It brings a whole new set of challenges, but the book has a great story about the author's mother and AI.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me about the author's mom and AI. What happened?
She was trying to use this AI drawing app, to make a profile picture for social media,
Okay.
but the app just wouldn't cooperate. It kept generating images that were completely wrong.
Oh, no. What was she trying to create?
She wanted a picture of herself playing piano with her dog. Simple enough, right? But no matter what she typed, the app kept showing like much younger women playing the piano. Finally, she got a silver-haired woman in the picture, but she wasn't playing, she was watching a younger woman play.
Wow. Sounds like the AI had some preconceived notions about age and piano players.
Yeah, it really raises those concerns about bias in AI. The data you use to train it, it can reflect those biases, and the algorithms can make them even worse.
That's a scary thought. And for marketing, that could mean, discriminatory targeting, certain groups not even seeing certain ads.
Exactly. It's something we need to be very aware of.
So how do we address this? How do we use AI responsibly, ethically, and in a way that aligns with data protection?
AI governance. It's about having clear principles, processes for developing and using AI, making sure it's used the right way.
Okay, AI governance. So what does that look like practically?
It starts with understanding the different types of AI being used in marketing. Analytic AI, generative AI, and interactive AI, as the book calls them.
Okay, broke those down for me. What's the difference between them?
Analytic AI is all about data crunching, finding patterns, trends, insights. It's what powers things like predictive analytics, customer segmentation. Generative AI is about creating new content, text, images, even video. Think of those tools that can write ad copy or product descriptions automatically.
So AI that analyzes and AI that creates.
Got it. What about interactive AI? That's all about AI systems that can, well, interact with humans in a more natural way, like think chatbots, virtual assistants.
So we've got AI that analyzes, AI that creates, and AI that chats.
Yeah.
Sound like each one has its own data protection considerations.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into after the break.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were starting to unpack the different ways AI is being used in marketing and how that all ties in with data protection. Feels like AI is adding another layer of complexity to an already complex topic.
It is. But I think it's good to remember those GDPR principles we talked about. Transparency, fairness, accuracy, accountability. Those still apply, maybe even more so with AI.
So it's not a total reset. We can build on what we already know.
Exactly. And when you look at those different types of AI, analytic, generative, interactive, each one has its own set of data protection challenges.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of those challenges marketers need to be aware of?
Data minimization, that's a big one. With AI, it's tempting to, collect all the data you can get your hands on, thinking, oh, more data, better results.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tempting.
But that can lead to collecting too much, things that aren't relevant, which goes against GDPR.
Right, finding that balance again, being smart about what we collect.
Exactly. And then there's transparency. AI can be, well, really complex. It can be hard to explain how it works, what data it's using to make decisions.
So if a customer asks, hey, why am I seeing this ad? We might not have a simple answer.
Yeah, that's possible. And that can be a problem for trust. If we can't explain it, how can we expect people to feel good about sharing their data?
Good point. Transparency builds trust. What else? What other challenges should we be thinking about?
Accuracy and fairness, especially with AI. We talked about bias earlier, how AI can, make those biases worse.
Yeah, that's a big one. We need to watch out for that. Make sure the data we use to train our AI isn't, perpetuating those biases.
Absolutely. And then, of course, security. AI systems can be hacked, manipulated. That could lead to data breaches, other problems.
So security is always important,
Yeah,
but even more so with AI, the stakes are higher.
definitely. And finally, there's accountability. It can be tough to figure out who's responsible when something goes wrong with AI.
Right, because it's an algorithm making the decisions, not a person. So who do we hold accountable?
That's the million-dollar question. We need to establish clear lines of responsibility. Someone has to be ultimately accountable for what the AI does, even if it's a complex algorithm.
It's a lot to figure out, but the good news is we're not alone in this. Regulators are starting to address AI too. The EU's AI Act, that's a big one.
Right. It's about creating a legal framework for AI in the EU. They're taking a risk-based approach. Certain AI systems are just prohibited, because they're too risky. Others are considered high risk, used in sensitive areas like healthcare, and those face more scrutiny, more regulation.
So some AI is off limits, some needs extra attention? Makes
Yeah.
sense.
And the good news for marketers is that, well, most of what we do with AI is probably going to be low risk, which means, hopefully, fewer regulatory headaches.
That is good news. So as long as we're using AI responsibly, ethically, sticking to those GDPR principles, we should be okay.
That's the key takeaway. AI doesn't change the fundamentals of data protection. It just means we need to apply them more carefully, more thoughtfully.
This deep dive into data protection has been amazing. We've covered so much: the history, GDPR, data subject rights, working with partners, data security, and of course AI, the challenges and the opportunities it brings.
It's a lot to take in, but it's important stuff.
It is. And I think the big takeaway is that data protection isn't about, stifling creativity, slowing us down. It's about being responsible, transparent, respecting the people whose data we're using.
It's part of building trust, creating those strong customer relationships that really matter.
Well said. And Scheuing's book, How to Use Customer Data, it's a great guide for all of this. Really gives marketers the tools they need to do this right.
Couldn't agree more. It's a must read.
Definitely. And one last thought for our listeners, a question from the book to keep in mind. How can marketers use the principles of data protection to build stronger customer relationships and brand loyalty?
It's a great question. It makes you think about data protection differently, not as a burden, but as a way to build trust, deepen those connections.
Respecting data privacy is not just the right thing to do, it's good for business too.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
This podcast is brought to you by Liminal Martech. Liminal is the first Portuguese company specialized in strategic consulting and marketing operations. If you want to grow your business and deliver better customer experiences with marketing technologies such as CRM, automation, and BI, go to www.liminal.pt and find out how. Go to www.liminal.pt to know Salesforce, HubSpot, Zoho, or Ample Market Solutions.